Have you ever planned a vacation using an online travel platform? Maybe you wanted to check out what the popular attractions were or book a tour wherever you were going. They can be great tools to help you explore a new city or give you some insight before visiting an unfamiliar country. Historic places are often at the top of these sites. You might see things like castles, old temples, or heritage houses. And these places have always been a favorite of mine when I'm traveling. I was at this old villa in Europe last year. It was built between 1914 and 1915 for a wealthy industrialist and his family. Inside, you can see remnants of the old tile that used to line the kitchen. And when you walk to the large windows in the back, you can see that it sits on the shores of a beautiful lake used for swimming and boating. After the last private resident sold the property, it had several uses before it was turned into a museum and opened to the public in the 1990s. Right now, you may be thinking of a similar place that you've been. Did you go there because you wanted to take in some local history? Or maybe you were curious about artifacts or architecture from a time gone by. As humans, we love to explore these places because they thin the veil between then and now and give us a sense of experiencing a fragment of history that we're unable to get by just reading a book or watching a movie. I first became interested in the way that historic sites are presented to the public after I visited 2 places in 2022. First, I traveled to New Orleans, Louisiana. I wanted to tour plantations there because I have connections to the African American community in the South, and I've always been curious about this part of my heritage. At one, called Oak Alley Plantation, the first thing I was struck by was the picturesque scenery. It looked like a set from Gone with the Wind. I also was surprised that I could get a mint julep, a classic Southern cocktail, while I waited for the tour to start. With the tickets we purchased, we toured the Big House. This is the house where the white enslaving family lived and gets its name, Big House, from its relation in size to the smaller slave cabins where the Black people who worked the sugarcane fields lived. On the tour, you're shown around by a guide who points out pieces of furniture and talks about the family who lived there prior to the start of the American Civil War. You walk through the private rooms of this family, their dining room, their sitting room, their bedrooms, and you get a glimpse of the illustrious and privileged lives they would have led. The tour ends by the guide flinging open the doors to a huge balcony on the 2nd floor, where you're encouraged to marvel and take pictures of the 300-year-old alley of oak trees that lines the main pathway. Afterwards, if you're interested, you can explore the Slavery at Oak Alley exhibit, but it's not part of the main tour. The slavery exhibit is a short walk from the Big House and includes several wood slave cabins that were recreated in the 2010s. You can walk inside of them and experience how small they are and learn about various parts of enslaved life. But our time was limited, and I noticed that many people decided to skip this exhibit altogether. It wasn't the main reason for the visit. Later that year, I flew to Germany. It's always been a bucket list place for me because I've always been fascinated with World War II. In Berlin, I signed up to do a walking tour of the city that focused on its history. For an entire crisp autumn day, I walked through the streets of Berlin with a group of other tourists while our guide pointed out and explained various landmarks: the Reichstag building, the Berlin Palace, old Nazi architecture, and memorials to the victims of the Holocaust. Many of the places we visited seemed to be designed not only for out-of-town tourists, but for the local German population as well. I also kept noticing how much more focus there was on education and the role that these places played in educating future generations from all over the world. There were school groups and different languages being spoken everywhere. After returning to Victoria, I had a lot of questions about the different experiences I'd had in these two countries. I kept wondering how there could be such a difference in the way that these two countries approach their own histories. At the plantation in Louisiana, it seemed like the focus was on the tourist experience and making sure everyone had their gone with the wind experience, even though slavery was the primary reason for that way of life. In Germany, it felt like they wanted you to feel the full weight of history and to learn something. I realized I needed to dig deeper into the ideas of remembrance and memorialization. And so I signed up to do my graduate degree in history. From my research, I found that when we visit sites of historical significance, we're more easily able to relate to what we're learning about and seeing. When we stand in these places, our minds are allowed to wander. And for a fraction of a second, we might imagine what it would have been like to have lived in the place where we're standing. What would we be doing? Who else might have been there? What would we be wearing? This run of the imagination can be fun, especially if we're standing someplace like a castle and imagining ourselves to be a king or a queen. But what if the place we were standing was asking us to face more difficult history? What if we were standing here? Those astute historical buffs among you may know what you're looking at, but some of you may not. It might just look like a picture of abandoned railway tracks taken on a sunny day through a dirty window. But this is the view from the iconic main watchtower overlooking the selection ramps at Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. The selection ramps are where hundreds of thousands of people were selected by the Nazis to either go to the gas chambers and immediate death, or to forced labor and the possibility of life. Beyond the ramps, you can see the sheer vastness of the camp, the barracks where the prisoners would have slept, and the trees beyond that hide the gas chambers themselves. I was standing here just over a year ago as part of a field school I attended for my degree. The room itself was stifling and austere. There was nothing there to take away from the discomfort. Instead, the whole experience seemed to force you to confront it. Walking up to the tower, climbing the narrow staircase, and entering the room where I knew Nazis would have stood was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The indescribable inhumanity of Auschwitz-Birkenau is something that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. But the experience in the watchtower, that was unexpected, and it felt like a different kind of remembering. I took this picture because I knew I wanted to remember the experience of being there. It's easy to imagine ourselves in the role of the hypothetical good guy, as the benevolent ruler looking to pardon someone rather than ordering their execution, or even the victim of the bad guy, just looking to survive one more day. It's much harder to experience and learn about things that we find hard to relate to or make us feel uncomfortable. But perpetrator and victim sites are inextricably linked, and we can learn something valuable from both experiences. Research has shown that when looking at dark histories, like slavery, genocide, or colonization, it's that much more important to tell an honest and inclusive story rather than a story that's only part of the truth. Or, perhaps even worse, as we see happen in many plantations, tell a story that wraps up the difficult parts neatly in a bow without asking us to reflect on what truly occurred. We need to be given the full context of a place, the entire story, for us to truly appreciate what happened and to learn. The word story is important. When we think about public history sites or the discipline of history writ large, we like to think about them as being about truth, as being based on dates and facts. But history is ultimately about storytelling. It may include dates and facts, but as a society, we choose who gets to tell the story, whose story is told, and whose stories are not told. What we're taught and what we choose to teach about plays a crucial role in shaping the narratives we generate about certain events and their reflection of what we hold to be valuable as a society, and the information we choose to include is not only shared with our own citizens, but the rest of the world as well. Do you remember this villa? I started out by telling you about this place that I visited last year, and none of the information I gave you was false. But I only told you part of the story. A more complete history of this villa is that it is located just outside of Berlin, Germany, and is famous for one reason and one day in particular, January 20th, 1942. On that day, more than 83 years ago, 15 Nazi officials met to discuss and solidify the details of the final solution. This was the name that the perpetrators gave to the mass murder of European Jewry during the Holocaust, and the meeting itself became known as the Wannsee Conference. It's now a museum and an education center for this reason. As a newly minted historian, I'm, of course, interested in history, but I'm more interested in the way that we as people living in the 21st century interact with history. So, before I finish, I invite you to consider a few questions. How do we as a society preserve and display historic sites for the public? How do we as visitors experience them? And how does this shape the stories we tell ourselves about our own collective past and the ideas we bring with us into the future?